Hello, everyone. That was quite the intro. Thank you. So today we're going to be doing a crash course in server components in Nuxt, of course. So, some of you might know who I am. If you are one of those people, put in the chat where you know me from. Maybe it's Twitter or my newsletter or something like that. But most of you don't know who I am. So let me give you a quick introduction to myself. So this year, me and Alex Lichter have started a Vue podcast called Deja Vue, and we've got some awesome guests on there. Eduardo has been one of those guests. We've had Daniel Rowe, Evan Yu, and a whole bunch of other amazing people. So definitely check that out if you are into podcasts. I also have this weekly newsletter where every week I send out a bunch of tips on Vue and Nuxt, and we're almost at our 200th week in a row. And I'm surprising myself in that I haven't missed a week at all in there, although a couple days it has been close. But better late than never is my motto. 2 years ago, I launched with the help of Vue School. We partnered together and created the official course on Nuxt called Mastering Nuxt. You might be familiar with that. I've got a little bit more to say about that at the end of my talk, so stick around for that. And of course, this is what I do, is Vue content. And so if you like to read articles or any other kind of content, I've created it. And yeah, so here we are, and I'm giving you a talk, and this is part of all the stuff that I do. So let's get into server components here. And with server components, what is the whole point of them anyway? Well, we get islands of server-side rendering. So normally with a Nuxt application, we can decide based on the route, this one's going to be server-side rendered, this one's going to be client-side rendered, or the default, which is the universal approach, where we first do a server-side render and then hydrate into the client-side rendering. Well, with server components, we get much more fine-grained control over how that works. We can specify specific components that will be server-side rendered only, and they won't get hydrated on the client. And every time their props change, we actually make a round trip back to our server to get the new updated HTML. And so this has, just like with server-side rendering, a bunch of performance benefits. For example, something like syntax highlighting requires a whole lot of code in order to do it. And it's best if we don't have to ship all of that code to the client. But with server-side components or server components, we can instead have all that code, we keep that on the server. And every time we need to update our syntax highlighting component, we just get the new updated HTML. We don't have to ship that code to the client every single time. But I don't want to talk about server components too much. I actually want to code some things for you. So with that, let me get into this demo app here that I've created. So to start, we've got this counter component, and that goes off the screen there, so I'll make that a bit smaller. And this component is doing two things. We are setting this initial count, which is via a prop. And then we've also got this interval that's gonna, as soon as we mount the component, we are going to every second increment that count. And then we've got this computed that combines the two things together. And this lets us see how we can combine props, and we'll be able to see how it hydrates on the client. So we'll just pop this in. We'll first do a counter, and you can see over on the left-hand side here, as soon as we render that, the count starts going up and up and up, just as we would expect. So let's add in the prop for ourselves here. So we'll do initial count, and we'll say, well, let's just make this a ref here. And we'll pop that in here. And we need a way to actually change this. So we'll do a little click handler here, which will do initial count plus equals 10. We'll have a little plus sign there. So now if we click on this, we can see that we're able to increment the initial count by 10 at the same time as this count is going up and up and up. So far, so good. Nothing new. We haven't talked about server components yet, but that's what we're going to do right now. So to make this counter into a server component, all that we need to do is change the file name to have this .server suffix. Now, once we do that, Nuxt handles the rest. It under the hood, it wraps it in a Nuxt island component, which you don't really need to worry about for the most part because it all handles it nicely for you. So we're going to quickly restart our server so that it picks up this new file name. And we'll close this here because I don't need that. And then if we come over to this counter here, we see that it's not counting up. And if we think about it for a moment, that makes sense because this is only it's only rendered on the server. And so this on mounted, it never gets called. We just get that static HTML back. But if we click on this increment button here, we do get it updated and without a full page refresh or anything like that. And that's because every time the props for this component are updated, it will make a fetch to the backend that then returns our HTML to us. So if we go into our network tab here, we can actually see this happening. If I click this plus button a bunch of times, we see these network requests come in for this counter underscore, and then this hash. And then we get this query. If I can load this up, maybe I'll try and make that a little bigger so you can see it better. And yeah, you can see that we're sending this props with the initial count set to 120 or whatever it is. And the response that we get back has a couple things, but the most important part of it is that it has this HTML. And this is, in fact, the HTML that gets rendered to the page. So the neat thing about the fact that this does network requests like this is that we can rely on the browser's native request caching. So let me add in a decrement button. Do this and put a little minus sign there. And then I'll refresh this page so that it renders correctly there. And okay, so I'm going to pull this up so we can see a bit more. So if I increment a bunch of times, we get all of these calls here. But then if I decrement, we don't have any new calls because what the browser is doing is it's saying, well, we've already made this request for initial count is equal to 30. So we can just rely on the previous value that we've already fetched. And we get a little bit of a performance boost there. And that's pretty neat. The next thing on the list of things I wanted to show you today is how we can actually nest interactivity inside of these components. So I'm going to change this counter component back to a regular Vue component, regular Nuxt component rather, or Vue component, I guess would be technically correct as well. So we're going to comment this out because we don't want this in there for now. And let me just clean this up. So we're going to see how we can actually put interactive client-side components inside of our server components. So I'm going to create a new component. We're going to call it server component because I'm very good at naming things. Oh, I didn't even spell that correctly. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Server component. We'll put this in, rendered on the server. And one thing to keep in mind with our server components here is that these components are required to have a single root. If you have multiple root nodes, for example, if instead of everything being inside of this single div, if you put multiple divs at the root here, you'll get a weird error that's kind of hard to debug and figure out what's going on. So if you get some like weird error, sometimes it's like I think it's a query selector all thing. That's probably what's going on there. So we have this rendered on the server, and we'll put in our counter component. We'll say initial count equals 23. Why not? Now we're going to come to our app here, our main page, and we will put in our server component. Oh, I typoed on that as well. I'm just missing R's all over the place, aren't I? All right. So we'll need to restart that guy again so it picks up the new file. And once that goes, there we go. We have this rendered on the server, just like we would expect, and our counter stuck at 23, just like we would expect. It's inside of a server component, so it's just rendering that static HTML. Now, that's not that interesting. I was going to show you how we can actually make this interactive. And so the first step is actually to go into our Nuxt config, and we've got to add in this value for an experimental component islands, and then selective client is true. And no, I do not have that memorized. I've got some notes that I'm following because this is the kind of thing that, no matter how many times I'm going to use this, I will always forget. Once we do that, we can add in this Nuxt client attribute. And as soon as we do that, we can see that this counter is ticking up. And so what's going on here is that this component here, this div is being rendered only on the server, but within it, we have this counter component that is rendered on the server, just like every other component in our Nuxt app. But when it gets to the client, Nuxt will hydrate this component and make it interactive again. And the thing that this server component is not hydrated. So of course, there's no interactivity in this server component right now. So there is nothing really to hydrate, but I think you get my point there. The one thing that we're missing is some props for this guy. So let's connect up some props here and see how that goes. So we'll do initial count. We'll give it a default value here. Define props. And yeah, I want to make this TypeScript. And we will do initial count is a number. And we'll pop this in here. And then we have to go over here and actually set that initial count. Don't know why that IntelliSense doesn't like to do the hyphen case there. Okay. So now, when we click on these buttons, we can see that they are working just as we would expect. So we've now got a server component with a client component nested inside of it. The last thing that I want to show you today is something that I think is, I mean, it's another neat thing that you can do with server components because let's be honest, the whole thing is pretty neat. And I wish I could, have 10 times as much time to show you all the things that you can do with these because there's a whole lot and they're really, really useful. But I'm going to show you this idea of paired components. So if you've got a component, let's imagine for a second that the counter component, we've got a whole bunch of logic just for what happens on the server. But then when we get to the client, we've got a whole other set of logic. And we're not reusing the logic in the same way. Well, we can actually split up the logic between these two components by creating two different versions of our component. So this first one, I will call counter.server, let's say. And this one is going to be called counter.client. So we created our server component like we did before, but now we've introduced this client component as well. And what this one does is it has these two halves. When we hydrate this on the client side, it'll actually switch to using this client component and it won't even ship this server component in the bundle to the end user. So what we can do is in the server component, well, we know that this onMounted is never going to get called because it doesn't get called on the server. So we can get rid of that. And if we don't need that offset to change, then we can actually just get rid of all of that as well. And we can, in fact, just have this prop set straight away. Now, we have renamed our files here. So we've got to restart a couple things here. But now we should see that our component here, something is going on here. Let me quickly check. There we go. Okay. The dangers of live coding, So we now have this component and it does exactly what we would expect it to do. If I change this to 60, for example, it'll server-side render, set that initial count to 60 and it returns that. But when it gets to the client side, it actually hydrates with all of the counting logic. So here, the server-side component, this half is as simple as it can be. And then when we get to the client, we add in this extra logic to actually make it interactive. So that's it for my demo. Whoa, okay, overshot that one. Now, just a couple things that I wanted to mention. I said before, must have a single root element. That's important to remember. And a performance consideration is that due to the way that these are implemented, every time we make one of those calls to the backend, we treat it as its own entire Nuxt app. So when we re-render that counter component, when that initial count is changed, it's actually an entire Nuxt app with just that single component in order to isolate things and make it all work. So if you have like 7 different server components on your page, that's actually going to create 7 plus your initial app, Nuxt apps that are being rendered. So that can actually create some performance issues. And so if you can consolidate things into a single island like this, a single server component, then that's the ideal. We can also make pages server or client only just by doing this suffix thing like we have seen. And it works essentially how you would expect. The client one is only rendered on the client and the server one is only server-side rendered. And if you like tips like this and want to know more about Nuxt tips, well, I just released, a few months ago, released this book, Nuxt Tips Collection, where you can get a ton of different tips. There's 117, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I forget these little details all the time. And not only tips, but it's got this this ebook that you can get. And along with that ebook, you get a series of emails. And in fact, 11 weeks of emails. And I actually had someone a couple weeks ago tell me that they were stuck debugging an issue with their Nuxt app. And that morning they got an email with a tip about plugins and how you can reorder them. And, that was what they needed to have that light bulb moment. And they were able to solve the issue. So the timing of these things can be really helpful sometimes because you're getting new tips in every day that you can just maybe it jogs that creativity or something. And yeah, it's really helpful. There's also some code repos if you want to dig deeper, and you can find that at my website /Nuxt tips collection. I'm pretty sure you can just Google that as well and it'll come up. But yeah, and a special offer for all of you here today. Thank you for watching my talk and spending some time with me. If you want to get 50% off of this Nuxt Tips collection, I've got a code, NuxtNation 2024, and there are only 20 of them though. So the first 20 of you who go and get that code, you can get the Nuxt Tips collection for a pretty good discount. And my one last thing is about Mastering Nuxt. It was created and launched 2 years ago now, actually just over 2 years. And we know that Nuxt 4 is coming. So I want to make sure that you know that if you own Mastering Nuxt 3 or buy it in the next however long, we will be updating and redoing the course for Nuxt 4. The timing of that is uncertain as of now, but you will get that as a free upgrade from Mastering Nuxt 3 to Nuxt 4. And I mean, the reason is there's not a whole lot, the fundamentals haven't changed a whole lot from Nuxt 3 to Nuxt 4. And so, I mean, Daniel and the team have shipped so many features in the last 2 years. And obviously those things have changed, but the actual core pieces and the things that we cover in the course are still valuable and relevant. So with that, here are some of my links if you want to find me elsewhere. And once again, thank you for coming to my talk. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. All right, we do have a couple questions from the audience.
All right.
First up, in practice, what would you define as client component and what as server comp? How to decide?
That is a very good question. And I think it's the same thing that the same way of thinking of it that you would with like a server side rendered page. So a lot of times yeah, I thought I had a good answer, but as I'm going through it, I'm realizing that I'm not sure. That's a very good question.
All right. We can follow up on it later.
Yeah, maybe we'll circle back to that one. My mind just
All right.
went blank.
I get that. Totally happens to me too. All right. Last question. Should all links be getting a Nuxt client prompt to navigate using the Vue router?
I am not sure. All links. So the Nuxt client prop, I don't think you need that for the Vue router. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to understand what this question is saying. So Nuxt client. So with the Nuxt link inside of a server component, I think that's what the question is getting at. If you have a Nuxt link inside of a server component, the whole point of a Nuxt link is that it lets you do all of these client side things. And so, yeah, I think if you put a Nuxt link inside of a server component and you didn't put this Nuxt client prop on, then it would just be a regular link tag. And so I would say that yes, if you want to use the Vue router on the client side, you would have to put the Nuxt client prop on to make that like fully client side interactive like that. Did that make
Perfect.
sense? That was a little
It did.
rambly.
At least it made sense to me. So I think it made sense. But do hit us up, everyone, if you have more questions. And that's it for us, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us
All
today.
right. Thank you.